Alright, so this summer marks the 25-year anniversary of The Bread of God, a psychedelic rock and roll poetry album the Formless Dreamer and I recorded back in the summer of 1992. Link in the description box. Believe it or not, while I know that many of you who regularly check in here know me primarily as philosopher, this particular album is what I'm actually most known for. Fans of the album who visit the channel usually don't know what to make of the philosophy presentations contained herein, and sometimes unsubscribe, not remembering how they got subscribed to me in the first place. And those who regularly tune in for the philosophy presentations usually don't know what to make of my experiments into music and film. Some of them get offended by these ventures and righteously unsubscribe as well. Well, what can I say? I have an affection for all three, philosophy, film, and music, in no particular order. And when you add to that photography, writing, and some acting, you'll have a better idea what the meta-sage is all about. Getting up in my years to the point where now I can look back with a broader perspective, I now know that my participation and contributions on this album represents my ultimate magnum opus. Which means, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, a large and important work of art, music, or literature, especially one regarded as the most important work of an artist or writer. I'll have to admit that this album represents my most important work in this life, a masterpiece of my youth, and a humble gift to the world. So I'm making this video to mark the 25-year milestone anniversary of this underground cult hit. Make note of its record of viewership, as it has also just hit another milestone of 3 million views. And to talk a little bit about it in general, as over the years since I first posted it back in 2011, there have been various questions regarding the recording of the album, and for basic background information surrounding this musical artifact. So in honor of these milestones, and in commemoration, I will relate a brief synopsis of the story for your consideration. So it was the summer of 1992, and I was a 22-year-old young man living in New York, my birthplace and hometown. I had met my closest friend, the Formless Dreamer, a few years earlier in 1986. The friendship was circumstantial happenstance, as we didn't go to the same high school, only coming to meet through a mutual friend at one of his summer BBQ parties held in the back patio of his Upper West Side 3-floor condominium. This is where we formed our clique. We were all teenagers, and naturally looked to hang out as often as we could, longing to bum around New York City, smoking cigarettes and drinking alcohol any chance we got. We continued to do this for a few years, becoming real good pals, maintaining our bond all throughout the entirety of our school days. Shortly after graduation in 1988, I moved out of my parents' place down in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, going out on my own relatively quickly to share a place as roommates with a couple of pals in an apartment up in the Bronx. This is where regular experiments with marijuana, mushrooms, acid, mescaline, and various other psychedelic substances began to occur with regular frequency. I stayed there for about a year and a half before moving out in 1990. getting a new apartment in Staten Island, where me and one of the previous roommates from the Bronx rented a first-floor apartment of a house. It was a cheap place because the commute was extensive and the neighborhood was rough. But I was young enough to be fearless of the mean streets and was physically game for the travel, as I enjoyed the pleasant boat rides back and forth between Manhattan and Staten Island, smoking a lot of joints out there, and didn't mind doing a lot of walking, sometimes miles at a time, as the times were tough and the money was tight, and every dime saved by not taking a bus or a taxi would actually make a difference. Eventually, in early 1991, I got a girlfriend who happened to live up on 110th Street and Broadway in Manhattan, and I would often end up staying there, as it was just so much easier to crash in the city rather than embarking on the long haul to Staten Island every night. The formless dreamer still lived with his parents on West 71st Street in Manhattan, not too far from my girlfriend's place. And so this is how the formless dreamer and I began to hang out again regularly. Soon after, we decided to start a band and record music. We had often played music and wrote songs together throughout our high school years, recording some of them on a basic analog tape player, with him playing guitar and me playing keyboards, and both of us singing. But we never really took it seriously until the summer of 1991. I had somehow managed to get a Tascam 4-track recorder and a microphone. I also had a crude keyboard, and the formless dreamer had an acoustic guitar and one effects pedal. This is when we began meeting every day, writing songs on his guitar in Central Park, filling up spiral notebook after spiral notebook with lyrics and ideas, and later recording many of them in a basement workshop in his building. We ended up recording a whole bunch of songs, enough for a few albums, but they were mostly bare-bones acoustic recordings, raw and unplugged. But this is how we honed our skills as composers, especially the formless dreamer, who had a natural songwriting ability that was rare and masterful. This was the same summer that I initiated and accompanied the formless dreamer on his first ever psychedelic trip. To say that this experience had an impact on him would be an understatement, as it ultimately opened him up to a brand new world, and he really began to blossom and flourish as a composer and lyricist. I took the opportunity to expose him to an eclectic array of music that he never really explored before, and it all had positive effects on his musicianship. In his younger days, he was mostly just into hard rock and heavy metal, with only a select interest in the genre of classic rock, with bands like Bruce Springsteen and the Rolling Stones. So he really didn't have that much exposure to the genres of blues, jazz, folk, and acid rock. I began giving him tapes of The Doors, Jimi Hendrix, Bob Dylan, and many others, and it all had a positive influence on his playing and the elements of style in his writing. Soon he became like a songwriting machine, pumping out classic song after classic song. His songwriting and guitar work expanding along with the expansion of his consciousness. This is when we began writing poetry and got inspired by the concept of a poetry album. Hence, we began working on new material and started recording some of our first poetry songs while coming to realize the limitations of our current equipment. As luck would have it, an answer to this concern came to fruition. We had long talked about the possibility of adding more members to the band, especially the likes of a lead guitarist, and the Formless Dreamer happened to know a guy that might fit the bill. We hung out with him and then decided to invite him into the fold. Soon after, we welcomed a new member to the band, Liquid Fingers, a family friend of the Formless Dreamer from his younger days. We had always wished that we could put strong solos into our music. And while the Formless Dreamer did provide some of this, he wasn't completely technically proficient in the skill, being more of a rhythm player at heart. Liquid Fingers filled this role, being a classically trained lead guitarist with chops in jazz, blues, rock, and metal. With Liquid Fingers also came a ton of new equipment, electric guitars, a second 4-track, a state-of-the-art synthesizer, amps, pedals, microphones, pickups, the whole 9 yards. And with all of this, the seeds of the bread of God became planted. As the Formless Dreamer and I dived headfirst into the new equipment and began to write and record a slew of new psychedelically inspired compositions, with Liquid Fingers now providing all the rip-roaring solos. We also managed to get a manager of sorts, a vinyl disc jockey with an active interest in the bands, who we affectionately called Ratso, due to his striking resemblance to both a human rodent and the character Ratso Rizzo from the movie Midnight Cowboy. Ratso got us a bass player, and I recruited a drummer, who was one of my old friends from high school. This made us complete. The Formless Dreamer and I continued to take psychedelic excursions while we developed the material for our new concept album, The Bread of God, which, according to our vision, would be an album created specifically for the purpose of tripping to. This was our goal. This was our vision. Ultimately, we wound up writing a ton of new material of all different types, including enough prose and music for a double poetry album. We finished recording it by the end of the summer and mixed down a few final versions. We even went on to write another poetry album in the fall, what we called The Last Show on Earth, and worked on that and other stuff into early 1993. It was at this time that suddenly the Formless Dreamer abruptly decided to quit the band and sever our friendship. I can't really go into details as to the whys and whereofs of the situation, as I respect his wishes for privacy and anonymity. But suffice it to say, the specifics of the circumstances left him with very little choice. Of course, I was devastated by this and suffered from it immensely for years. With the passing of time and the eventual complete loss of innocence came acceptance. But even to this day, there is still a fairly fresh scar from the loss of this friend. And so this is how it has remained for 25 years. And to be completely honest with you, this is the main reason why I have remained anonymous for all these years. Since I do not have permission to attribute his real name and identity to the album, and have no way to contact him, I decided to make everyone else connected to the album anonymous also, so as not to leave any trace of real information that might lead someone to the discovery of his identity. This was the only real way I could conceive of releasing the material and still honoring the particulars of the specific situation. It was either that or not release it at all. So this is what led up to my publishing it in 2011. And so 6 years and 3 million views later, I acknowledge the 25-year anniversary of the Bread of God and salute the formless dreamer. I love you, man, and wish you nothing but the best. I'm sorry for everything that happened and wish I could have been a better, more responsible friend and gave you better counsel and support to honor your commitments. I was young and immature and not nearly as spiritually advanced as you were at the time. I reject some of my choices and actions and just ask to find it in your heart to forgive me. And even though I know you are not even hearing these words, I figured I would just put it out there in the off chance that you might stumble across it one day in the few years we have left. And you know, that's one of the kickers in this whole story, folks. His composing and musicianship has garnered a lot of fans, with over 3 million people hearing his work. And yet, he has no clue as to any of this. And that's a shame. But I will say this. If ever in the future the formless dreamer happened to reemerge and gave his blessings to share the more in-depth details of our story and release more material, some of which might reveal his name or identity or image, I would follow suit and reveal mine also. So if you ever hope to see a face reveal of the Metasage, then hope that the formless dreamer comes forward. It would be the only condition where I might consider dropping the anonymity. So until then, sit back, relax, click on the link, drop a tab, and enjoy the bread of God. And check out the last show on Earth. And as a PS, there's enough material left over from those tapes for a third poetry album, and the Formless Dreamer and I had often talked about a third poetry album. And so Liquid Fingers and I were talking about getting together and going through the painstaking process of transferring all that stuff from analog to digital, mixing it down, cleaning it up, and producing that album. But it is an endeavor that requires a lot of time and energy. But maybe we'll start doing that, so you'll have some new material to look forward to. Until then, enjoy the bread of God.